No one joins a cult. That's the thing people don't get. Nobody wakes up and decides to hand their life over to a stranger. They join a community. They join a family. They join somewhere they finally feel seen. And by the time they figure out what they actually joined, it's already too late. Charles Watson grew up in Cokeville, Texas. Population, small. Church on Sundays. Family that neighbors described as the nicest, finest people you'll ever meet. He was an honor student, captain of the football team, editor of the school paper. Set a state record in the low hurdles that stood for years. Church youth group leader, pre-law at North Texas State University, Pi Kappa Alpha fraternity. I need you to hold on to that image. Because on August 9th, 1969, that same person walked into a house in Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles, and said, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business. Hey guys, welcome back. I've been sitting with this case for a long time now. Not because of what happened, everyone knows what happened, but because of that question, how does a football captain from a Methodist family in Texas end up saying that line in a stranger's living room?" And here's what I want to say up front. This is not a video about Charles Manson being evil. We know that. This is a video about the steps. The specific, documented, named steps that turned normal people into people capable of doing what they did, because those steps have names now. Psychologists study them. Therapists recognize them. And once you see them, you'll recognize them too. That's what makes this case different from every other case I've covered, and that's why I couldn't let it go. But before we get there, there are people in this story who deserve to be more than footnotes. Sharon Tate was 26 years old, 8.5 months pregnant with her first child. She and Roman Polanski had already picked out his name, Paul Richard Polanski. Her father's name was Paul. He was an Army colonel. She adored him. She had just negotiated a fee of $150,000 for her next film. Her career was accelerating. Mia Farrow said she was as sweet and pure a human being as I have ever known. Patty Duke called her a gentle, gentle creature. The last book she read was Tess of the D'Urbervilles. She left it for Roman with a note saying it would make a beautiful film. Roman made that film 10 years later. He dedicated it simply for Sharon. On the evening of August 8th, she had dinner with 3 close friends at El Coyote Cafe. Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski. Jay was her former boyfriend. They stayed close after the breakup. He was there that night because Roman was in London and she was 9 months pregnant. And he didn't want her to be alone. Abigail Folger, Folger's coffee heiress, 25 years old, had been doing volunteer work with underprivileged kids in LA. She and Wojtek were staying in the guest cottage. Also on the property that night, Stephen Parent, 18 years old. He didn't know Sharon. He was visiting the caretaker. He was on his way out. None of them knew Charles Manson. None of them had anything to do with anything Manson was involved in. They were chosen because of an address, 10050 Cielo Drive. The previous tenant, a music producer named Terry Melcher, had refused to sign Manson to a record deal. Melcher had moved out months earlier. Manson knew that. He'd been to the house himself. He knew who lived there now, and he sent his family there anyway. I need you to sit with that for just a second, because that detail, that specific fact, is the thing that tells you exactly what kind of person we're talking about. Not impulsive, not random, calculated. Now, who was Charles Manson before all of this? Charles Miles Manson, born November 12th, 1934, Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother was 16. His father disappeared before he was born. His grandmother was a religious fanatic. His mother went to prison for robbery when he was still small. By the time he was 14, he'd already been in and out of multiple juvenile facilities. By 19 7 years of institutional living. Here's what's important about that. He wasn't just surviving in those places. He was studying them, watching the people around him, learning what worked. At Plainfield Boys School in Indiana, the one with a reputation for being particularly brutal, he discovered what he later called the insane game. Make people think you're unpredictable. Make them uncertain. Make them afraid to test you. Not because you're strong, but because they don't know what you'll do. He was storing things. We'll come back to this. Then Terminal Island Prison in Los Angeles. 3 years. This is where the real education happened. He got close to the pimps, and he listened. He learned 2 things from them that he would use for the rest of his life. 1, if you want someone to be unconditionally loyal, they need to both love you and fear you, not one or the other. Both. 2, find people who are vulnerable, genuinely struggling, but not so far gone that they can't function. The ones in between, those are the ones who follow. He also took a correspondence course from Dale Carnegie. You know the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People? He highlighted the line, the only way to influence another person is to talk about what they want and show them how to get it. He got out in 1967, 32 years old. He'd spent more than half his life in institutions, and he had a plan. California, Summer of Love. Haight-Ashbury, LSD everywhere. Young people looking for meaning, looking for belonging, looking for a father figure. He later said he understood immediately that being a proxeneta was a model from the past. The new model was the guru, and he knew exactly how to do that. He had a guitar. He had Dale Carnegie. He had 12 years of studying how people give up their will to someone else. Now here's where I need you to pay attention, because what happens next has a name, and you've heard it before. The first person he recruited was Mary Bruner, 23 years old, graduate of the University of Wisconsin, library assistant at UC Berkeley, stable job, good education, no history of anything concerning. She was, by all accounts, doing fine. Manson started sleeping on her couch. Then he moved in. Then he started bringing other women home. According to accounts at the time, she resisted at first. But before long, there were 18 people living in her apartment, and she was one of his most devoted followers. What happened between no and 18 people in her apartment? That's the question. And the answer is the thing that nobody explains about this case. So let me explain it. The same year, Manson was moving through Haight-Ashbury. Charles Watson was in Denton, Texas. Pre-law, at some point in that first semester, someone slipped him LSD. His family later said, that's when things shifted. He started using, stopped going home, stopped writing letters. He eventually moved to California. He was selling wigs in Hollywood. He picked up a hitchhiker who happened to know Dennis Wilson, drummer for the Beach Boys. Wilson invited Watson over. Watson pulled up to the house, and it was enormous. Nothing like Copeville, Texas. He walked in. There was a man sitting on the floor, playing guitar, surrounded by 5 or 6 young women. Watson later wrote, he looked up, and the first thing I felt was a sort of gentleness, an embracing kind of acceptance and love. Read that again. Acceptance and love. That's what a 22-year-old college dropout from Texas felt in that room. Not danger, not manipulation, not warning signs. Acceptance. That's what psychologists call love bombing. And it's the first step in a very specific playbook. Love bombing is not just being nice to someone. It's overwhelming acceptance. Intentionally, strategically, before someone has had time to evaluate what they're getting into. It creates what researchers call a debt of gratitude, a feeling that you owe this person who made you feel so seen, so wanted. Watson moved in, Watson stayed. And here's the thing. I want you to hold on to, I'll come back to it, but every single person who joined, The Manson family described the same first experience, overwhelmed by how welcome they felt, before anything else. Before ideology, before drugs, before helter-skelter, before any of that, they just showered me with affection. That's how Diane Lake described it. She was 14 years old when she joined. 14? Her parents had literally signed a note emancipating her so they could go live in a van. She met the family at a party in Topanga Canyon, and they ran toward her like they'd been waiting for her. I was totally looking for acceptance, she later said. That's what I found. And there is a part of that story, that specific part, that I think most people watching this have felt at some point. Not in a cult, not anywhere close to this. But that feeling of walking into a room and someone making you feel like you've been seen for the first time, that feeling is real. That feeling is human. And that's the door. So what happened after the door? I'll get to that. But first, I need to tell you about Leslie Van Houten, because her story is the one that doesn't fit the narrative of who joins these groups. Leslie Van Houten, born August 23rd, 1949. Altadena, California. Homecoming queen. Twice. Good family. Middle class. No history of anything concerning. Her parents divorced when she was 14. She started using drugs, marijuana first, then LSD. Her grades slipped. She had an abortion that, by accounts, her mother forced and then told her to bury the remains in the backyard. She was 19 when she met the Manson family. 19. I was absolutely intrigued and mesmerized by Manson, she later said. I believed he was someone very special and extraordinary. On July 11th, 2023, 53 years after the murders, Leslie Van Houten walked out of a California prison. Age 73, her attorney said she had to learn to use the internet. She had to learn to buy things without cash. It's a very different world than when she went in, her attorney said. Debra Tate, Sharon's sister, the last surviving member of Sharon's immediate family, had a different response. She said she hoped Van Houten gets a flashback of the screams, the grunts, the blood. I'm not going to tell you who's right. That question doesn't have a clean answer. And I want to come back to it at the end because it connects to something bigger. But right now, I want to show you exactly what happened between Homecoming Queen and murder, step by step, because every step has a name. And every name is something that psychologists recognize today, not just in cults, in workplaces, in relationships, in online communities. The first step we talked about, love bombing, overwhelming acceptance before evaluation. The second step is identity replacement. Every single member of the Manson family got a new name. Diane Lake became Snake. Leslie Van Houten became Lulu. Susan Atkins became Sadie Mae Glutz. This is not a coincidence. This is a technique. When you give someone a new name, especially when others around them start using that name, you're beginning to separate them from who they were before. The before starts to feel distant. The new you is the real you. The family is home. Step 3, isolation. Not dramatic, not sudden, gradual. Spahn Ranch. An old movie set in Chatsworth, California, 55 acres. No newspapers, no television. Books were prohibited. Manson, said writers, poisoned the mind. There was one Bible, Manson's. According to Leslie Van Houten's later testimony, at every single meal, Manson would lecture every meal, repetitively. At the remote ranch, where they were isolated from any other influences, Manson's was the only opinion heard. That quote is from the trial record, not from a psychology textbook. From the trial, step 4. This one is the one that's hardest to understand from the outside, and the one I keep thinking about, LSD as a control mechanism. Here's what Paul Watkins, a family member who eventually testified against Manson, said in court, Manson would encourage group LSD trips, but he himself would take lower doses, quote, to keep his wits about him, while everyone around him was in a suggestible, chemically altered state. He was lecturing. He was planting ideas. He was shaping what they experienced and how they interpreted it. David Smith, who ran the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic during that period, later wrote that Manson was attempting to reprogram his followers' minds to submit totally to his will, turning them into what Smith called empty vessels that would accept anything he poured. Step 5 is the one that completes the system, fear plus love. Not one or the other. Both from Diane Lake's memoir. She was 14 when she joined. She describes expecting to do something kind for Manson, something to please him. And instead, he would just haul off and hit her for no reason. Then say, that's your fault. You need a man to show you how to behave. And then warmth again, acceptance again, love again. That pattern, unpredictable punishment, followed by affection, is called intermittent reinforcement. It's what makes lab animals keep pressing a lever even when the reward is random. It's also what makes humans stay in situations they know are hurting them, because the good moments feel so much more intense when they're unpredictable. Love bombing, identity replacement, isolation, LSD as control, intermittent reinforcement. That's the playbook. And here's the thing. Here's the part that I genuinely could not stop thinking about. In 2018, 50 years later, a man named Keith Raniere was arrested in Mexico. He was the leader of NXIVM. It started as a self-help program. Courses, workshops, personal development, attracted celebrities, successful professionals, daughters of billionaires. He was convicted of racketeering, sex trafficking, and forced labor. He was sentenced to 120 years in prison. The psychological tactics his members described under oath: love bombing, identity replacement, isolation, sleep deprivation as control, the 2018 version of LSD, intermittent reinforcement, same playbook. 50 years later, different ranch, same steps. No one joins a cult. They join something that feels real. And by the time they realize what it is, the playbook has already worked. I'll get to what happens next, but I need you to hold one more thing in your head first, because there's a detail from the very beginning of this story that I haven't explained yet, and it matters more than anything else. I'm going to tell you, in 1967, the Beach Boys released an album. On that album was a song called Never Learn Not to Love. Nice title. Sounds like a love song. I'll come back to what it actually is at the end of this video, because right now you don't have enough information to understand why it matters. Stay with me. So we have the playbook, 5 steps, all documented, all named. Now I want to show you what that playbook built. Not just who joined, but what they became and how fast. By late 1967, Manson had moved the family to Los Angeles. Black school bus, painted over, Hollywood productions on the side, Mary Bruner, Susan Atkins, Lunette Fromme, and more arriving. Most of them young women, most of them from backgrounds that look, on paper, completely ordinary. Susan Atkins, born 1948, San Gabriel, California. Her mother died of cancer when she was a teenager. Her father abandoned her and her brother afterward. By 1967, she was working as a waitress, attending high school, trying to care for her brother. She dropped out junior year, moved to San Francisco. She met Manson on the street. He was playing guitar. He asked her to join him. She said yes. Patricia Krenwinkel, 19 years old when she met Manson, by all accounts, quiet, gentle, Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi would later call her case one of the most troubling because she had no obvious pathway there. She met Manson through a connection on the beach in Manhattan Beach. Within days, she had quit her job, left her car at the airport, and gotten on the bus. Within days, the family settled at Spahn Ranch, an old movie set, 55 acres of buildings that had been used for westerns, now mostly deteriorating. George Spahn was the owner, nearly 80 years old, almost completely blind. The women in the family did chores for him, kept him company, acted as his eyes around the property. In exchange, the family lived there for free. No outside news, no books, except one Bible, Manson's. At every meal, Manson talking. At every group LSD trip, Manson guiding, taking less himself. He told them books were poison. He told them their old families had never really loved them. He told them that out here, in this family, they were finally home. And then he told them something else. He told them the world was about to end. In late 1968, the Beatles released the White Album. Manson listened to it and announced it was a message to him from God. The song Helter Skelter, a loud, chaotic track. McCartney wrote, to prove the band could be as hard as The Who, Manson said was a prophecy. A race war was coming. Black Americans would rise up. White America would be destroyed. The black community would then be unable to govern themselves, Manson's words, not mine, and the family would emerge from the desert to rule what was left. It was apocalyptic. It was racist. It was, by any measure, completely disconnected from reality. And after months of isolation, after months of love bombing and identity replacement and LSD-enhanced lectures and intermittent punishment and reward, they believed him. Hold that thought, because there's a timeline here that I need to walk you through. And the timeline is the thing that makes this case what it is. 1968, Manson tried to get a record deal. He had connections. Dennis Wilson had introduced him to Terry Melcher, a producer, son of Doris Day. One of the most connected people in the music industry at the time, Melcher came to Spahn Ranch. He sat and listened politely. He did not offer a deal. Earlier, Universal had also given Manson studio time, 3 hours. The session went badly. The songs weren't commercial. The producer passed. Manson did not take rejection well. The family was also running out of money. Dennis Wilson had spent close to $100,000 on them over several months. Food, medical bills, cars they crashed, repairs to his property. Wilson eventually moved out of his own house to get away from them. By mid-1969, the family was broke, isolated at Spahn Ranch, and Manson was increasingly convinced the race war was coming and wasn't happening fast enough. He decided to accelerate it. July 31st, 1969. Gary Allen Hinman, 34 years old, music teacher, graduate student at UCLA. He had been friendly with members of the family. He'd let them stay at his house in Topanga Canyon en multiples occasions. Manson believed Hinman had recently inherited money. He sent Bobby Beausoleil and 2 women to get it. Hinman said he had nothing. They held him for 2 days. Manson came personally. He took a sword and cut off part of Hinman's ear. Then he left. 2 days later, Beausoleil stabbed Hinman to death. They wrote Political Piggy on the wall in his blood, trying to make it look like the Black Panthers did it. August 6th, police found Beausoleil in Hinman's car with a bloody knife. He was arrested. 3 days later, August 9th, Manson sent Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian to 10050 Cielo Drive. Watson cut the phone lines. He climbed the telephone pole in tennis shoes, no spikes, carrying 30-pound bolt cutters. The first person he encountered was Stephen Parent, 18 years old. Leaving the property, After visiting the caretaker, driving out, Watson shot him in the car. Then they went inside. Sharon Tate was 8.5 months pregnant. She begged them to let her live long enough to give birth. She was the last to die. Jay Sebring was tied to the same rope as Sharon. Abigail Folger made it to the lawn before she was caught. Wojtek Frykowski was shot twice, hit over the head, and found on the front lawn. The medical examiner's report documented 16 wounds on Sharon Tate. Jay Sebring had been shot and sustained multiple wounds. Susan Atkins wrote "Pig" on the front door of the house in Sharon Tate's blood. 5 people, one of them 18 years old, and had nothing to do with any of this. One of them unborn. The next night, August 10th, Manson joined the group himself. He said they'd been too messy. He wanted to show them how it was done. They drove to the Los Feliz neighborhood. Leno LaBianca, 44 years old, supermarket executive. His wife Rosemary, 38. They had no connection to Manson. No connection to the music industry. No connection to anything. Manson personally entered the house, tied the couple up, then left. He gave the orders and walked away. Watson, Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, the homecoming queen from Altadena, did the rest. They wrote "Death to Pigs" on the living room wall. "Helter Skelter" misspelled on the refrigerator door. In the LaBianca's blood, and then they hitchhiked home. The next morning, LAPD announced to the press that the Tate and LaBianca murders were probably not connected. They were working separate cases, separate teams, no coordination. August 16th, 7 days after the murders. More than 100 officers from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department raided Spahn Ranch. They arrested Manson and 25 others. They seized weapons. You guys, they had them. They had all of them. 7 days after the murders, they were standing right there. And then they released them because the search warrant had been misdated. A paperwork error, one wrong date. And the entire group walked. This is the thing I keep coming back to, not the murders, as incomprehensible as they are. But this moment, 100 officers, the actual killers, 7 days out, released because someone wrote the wrong date on a form. The LaBianca and Tate investigation teams were still not talking to each other. The connection between the two crimes wasn't officially noted until a report at the end of August, 3 weeks after the murders. The case wasn't cracked by detective work. It was cracked because Susan Atkins, already in custody for an unrelated charge, couldn't stop talking. She told cellmates what she'd done. A cellmate told a guard. December 1st, 1969, nearly 4 months after the murders, LAPD announced the warrants. 4 months. And a confession that was volunteered in a jail cell. The trial began in 1970. Vincent Bugliosi prosecuted. He built the case around Helter Skelter, the race war theory, as the motive. Manson arrived on the first day of court with an X carved into his forehead. He said he was crossing himself out of the establishment's world. The other defendants carved X's into their own foreheads in solidarity. They sat in court laughing. They camped outside the courthouse in support. They threatened witnesses. Some witnesses were drugged. Later, Manson's X became a swastika. That's the image most people know. In 1971, Manson, Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, Van Houten, all sentenced to death. In 1972, California abolished the death penalty. All sentences commuted to life. At sentencing, Manson said, "And I want this to stand here without any commentary from me. These children that come at you with knives, they are your children. You taught them. I didn't teach them. I just tried to help them. Stand up. Let that sit." Now, let me tell you about something that happened in 2018. A prosecutor named Moira Kim Penza stood in a courtroom in Brooklyn and described Keith Raniere leader of NXIVM, as quote commun, and a crime boss with no limits and no checks on his power. Raniere had started NXIVM in 1998. Self-help seminars, executive success programs, courses that cost between $6,000 and $10,000. He attracted a Seagram's liquor heiress who invested $150 million. He attracted the actress Allison Mack from Smallville. He attracted politicians. He attracted successful professionals from multiple countries. From the outside, a personal development organization. From the inside, according to testimony from members, love bombing first. For a brief, shining moment, there was a vision of Camelot. One longtime member testified. Then, identity within the group. Titles. Rankings. Vanguard for Raniere. The more you advanced, the more you belonged. Then, sleep deprivation. 500 calories a day. 3 a.m. walks in winter. Cold showers. Not as punishment, framed as growth. As what committed members did, then intermittent reinforcement, shamed for not completing assignments, when exhausted, praised for compliance. A Psychology Today analysis of the NXIVM case identified the exact same psychological sequence that researchers who study high control groups have documented for decades. Obedience to authority, de-individuation, loss of self within the group, depletion, exhaustion that breaks down resistance. Raniere was convicted in 2019, sentenced to 120 years. And his members, just like Manson's, included people who by every external measure had no reason to be there. Professionals, educated, successful, exactly the kind of people who would have said, if you'd asked them before, I would never fall for something like that. Here's what one NXIVM member said, a person who eventually testified against Raniere. No one joins a cult. No one. Same playbook, 1969, 2018. Different ranch, same steps, same result. And the question I can't shake, the one I want you to actually sit with, is not how did those people not see it coming? The question is, how do we explain the 50 years between Manson and Raniere and the fact that the playbook worked both times? What does that tell us? About the playbook itself? About the conditions that make it effective? I don't have a clean answer, and I'm not going to pretend I do. But there's one more piece of this story I need to tell you because it connects to that question directly. Jim Jones, 1955, Indianapolis, Indiana. He started a church, People's Temple. He preached racial integration at a time when that was genuinely radical, when interracial marriage was still illegal in some states. He opened his doors to people who had been turned away everywhere else. One member described it, we were not accepted. Her family didn't accept me. My family didn't accept her. And it was really important to us to have a place where we were embraced and celebrated. That's not manipulation. That's a real need. That's belonging. By the 1970s, People's Temple had thousands of members in California. Politicians praised Jones. He was respected. He had real influence. And behind closed doors, beatings, forced labor, members blackmailed into signing over their homes and savings to the church, rehearsals for a mass suicide. One member, who eventually escaped, filed an affidavit with the U.S. government 6 months before it happened. She described what was happening. She described the conditions. She described the rehearsals. The government noted it. Jones moved his entire operation to Guyana to avoid scrutiny. The government let him November 18th, 1978. 918 people died. At Jonestown, 304 of them were children. 304 children. And before you say, that's different from Manson, here's what's the same. The entry point was belonging. Real belonging. for real people with real needs who had been failed by other systems before they ever walked in the door. Manson found people who were looking for family. Jones found people who were looking for justice. Raniere found people who were looking for purpose. 3 different promises, 3 different decades, 3 different contexts. Same playbook, same result. And here is the question that I genuinely do not have a clean answer to. What is it about the conditions in this country, the loneliness, the fracturing of community, the specific vulnerabilities of people in their 20s who are looking for meaning that keeps producing the same opening for the same playbook to work? I don't know. I'm being honest with you. I don't know. What I do know is this. The playbook is not mysterious. It's documented. It has names. Psychologists have studied it for 50 years. And yet it worked in 1967. And it worked in 2002. And it worked in 2015. And it will work again. Because the playbook doesn't start with something that looks like danger. It starts with something that looks like home. Now, back to the trial. Back to what happened. To the people in this story. Watson was convicted in October 1971, 7 counts of first-degree murder. He was 25 years old. In prison, he became a born-again Christian, founded a ministry, became an ordained minister. He has been denied parole 18 times. His next hearing is scheduled for 2026. Patricia Krenwinkel, the 19-year-old who left her car at the airport and got on the bus within days of meeting Manson, has been denied parole 14 times. In May of 2025, while I'm making this video, a state board recommended parole for Krenwinkel for the second time. She is 77 years old. She is still incarcerated. While waiting for the governor's decision, she has said publicly that Manson was abusing her before the murders occurred. Susan Atkins, the woman who couldn't stop talking in the jail cell, the one whose confession actually cracked the case, died in prison in 2009. She was 61 years old. Charles Manson himself died in prison on November 19th, 2017. He was 83 years old. He never expressed remorse. In interviews he gave over the decades, there are hours of footage. He consistently described himself as a victim of the system. In one of those interviews, the one that actually became part of the public record, he was asked directly if he felt guilty. He said, "I haven't done anything I'm ashamed of. Maybe I haven't done enough. I might be ashamed of that, for not giving enough, for not being more perceptive, for not understanding." There it is. That quote, no commentary needed. And then there's Diane Lake. She was 14 when she joined. She was arrested with the family in October 1969. She was 16 when she finally told the grand jury her real name. Her arresting officer took her in as a foster child after the psychiatric evaluation. She testified against Manson. She went on to graduate both high school and college. She worked in banking. She worked in special education for 10 years. She got married. She had children. She had grandchildren. For decades, she told no one. She carried it. In 2017, she published a memoir. She described the moment she understood what she'd been part of. Tex Watson had a newspaper, the Tate LaBianca murders on the front page. He slapped it and said, "I did this. Charlie told me to. It was my first knowledge of the murders," she wrote. She was 17 years old when she found out the people she'd been living with, the people who had showered her with affection, had killed 5 people in a house in Benedict Canyon. The title of her memoir is Member of the Family. And now, finally, I need to come back to the Beach Boys. In 1968, during the period when Manson was living at Dennis Wilson's house, spending Wilson's money and pitching himself as the next big thing Wilson convinced the band to record one of Manson's songs. The original title was Cease to Exist. Cease to exist. That was the instruction Manson gave his followers. Stop being who you were. Stop existing as an individual. Give yourself over. The Beach Boys renamed it, changed some of the lyrics, put it on their album without crediting Manson. They called it Never Learn Not to Love. I told you at the beginning I'd come back to that. Now you know why. Never learn not to love. That's the instruction. That's the whole mechanism in 4 words. Never learn to stop loving Charlie. No matter what he does, no matter what he asks, never learn that distance. Might keep you safe. Watson felt it the first time. He walked into a room and Manson looked up from his guitar. Von Houten felt it when she was 19 years old and someone finally made her feel like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Lake felt it at 14. They just showered me with affection, and it was everything her own family hadn't been able to give her. The song was a flop, by the way. The Beach Boys version didn't chart. Manson never got his credit. That was the wound that never healed. And the house on Cielo Drive, the address he sent his family to on August 9th, was the house Terry Melcher had just moved out of. Manson knew Melcher was gone. He knew Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski lived there, and he sent them anyway. I've read a lot about this case. I've read people who say it was purely about accelerating the race war. I've read people who say it was about money. I've read people who say it was about control. Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe none of them fully explain it. What I keep coming back to is this. A man who spent decades learning how to make people need him, who built a system specifically designed to make people unable to stop loving him, ultimately used that system to make people do things that destroyed their own lives, along with everyone else's. Watson, denied parole 18 times. Krenwinkel, 77 years old, still waiting. Van Houten, out at 73, learning to use the internet. Atkins, died in prison. Manson, died in prison. And Deborah Tate, Sharon's sister, has spent 50 years showing up at every parole hearing, every one, saying her sister's name, making sure it doesn't get lost in the story of the man who gave the orders. Sharon Marie Tate, January 24th, 1943. August 9th, 1969, 26 years old. She hated wearing shoes. She kept little jars of Vaseline in her car. She spoke fluent Italian. She was going to name her son Paul after her father. Her tombstone has both names, Sharon and Paul. The last book she read, the one she left for Roman, with a note saying it would make a beautiful film. Roman made it. 10 years later, he dedicated it simply for Sharon. That's where I'm going to leave this. Not with Manson, not with the playbook, not with the question I don't have an answer to. With her,